The first time I heard the word broken used to describe me, it came from a woman who did not know the first thing about my life. She said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Poor Claire. Still single, still alone. Some women are just broken. I remember standing there with a bag of groceries in my hand, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. People on the porch pretended not to listen, but they listened. Everyone always listened when Marlene spoke. Marlene was the kind of woman who knew everything about everyone, or at least she liked to act like she did. She had the perfect front yard, the perfect haircut, the perfect smile, and the perfect habit of making other people feel small so she could feel tall. For years, she made my life into a neighborhood joke. If I bought flowers, she said I was trying to impress men who would never want me. If I wore a nice dress, she said I was clearly desperate. If I stayed home on weekends, she said it was because lonely women get used to walls talking back. And the worst part was that some people laughed, not because they were cruel, maybe. Some of them laughed because they were weak. Some laughed because it was easier than defending me. And some laughed because they were grateful it was not them standing in my place. I never answered her with anger. I never shouted. I never made a scene. I just kept walking. I kept my head up, my face calm, and my heart locked tight, because the truth was, I had spent so many years being judged for a life Marlene did not understand that I had stopped expecting kindness from the outside world. But what nobody knew was that I had started noticing things. Small things. Things Marlene thought were too invisible to matter. The way her husband Richard never looked at her when she was talking. The way his hands shook when he opened his truck door. The way he always checked his phone twice before walking into the house. The way his face changed when he thought no one was watching. At first, I told myself not to care. People like Marlene live in other people's business because they are running away from their own. That was the truth I kept repeating to myself. But one evening, everything changed. And the thing that changed my life was not a scream, not a fight, not a public humiliation. It was a diary. A secret diary I was never meant to find. And once I opened it, I discovered that the woman who had spent years calling me broken was building her own life on a lie so dark, so ugly, that it could have burned her whole perfect little world to the ground. My name is Claire. I was 36 when this story really began. Though honestly, Marlene would have told you I had been left behind much earlier than that. She loved saying my age like it was evidence in a courtroom. 36, and still single. She would whisper in that sweet, poisonous voice of hers. At some point, Claire, a woman has to ask why nobody stayed. She used to say it when we passed each other on the sidewalk. She said it when we stood in line at the grocery store. She said it at the church picnic. She said it in front of people who didn't even know me well enough to know how cruel it was. I lived alone in a small white house at the end of Maple Street. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't modern, but it was mine. I bought it after years of saving every dollar I could. People in the neighborhood treated my house like a mystery because I lived there by myself. In places like ours, people still ask questions like a woman's life is only complete if a man's name is attached to it. Why doesn't she have children? Why did she never marry? Was she too picky? Was she too cold? Was something wrong with her? I had heard all of it. What nobody asked was whether I had a life before the silence, whether I had loved and lost, whether I had dreams and disappointments, whether there had been a time when I believed in forever so deeply that it nearly destroyed me when forever did not happen. I had once been engaged. His name was Daniel. I met him when I was 29, before I learned how to protect myself. He was the kind of man who made you believe you had finally been seen. He remembered little things. He asked real questions. He made coffee the way I liked it. He held my hand in public without making me feel like I was asking for too much. I thought I had found my person. Then one day, I found messages on his laptop. Not just cheating, not just a mistake. A second life. A woman in another city. A child he had never told me about. A whole hidden world behind his smile. When I confronted him, he cried. He begged. He said he loved me. He said he was going to fix it. But once trust is shattered, Love becomes a strange and hollow thing. I ended it, quietly, cleanly, no drama, but after that, something in me changed. I stopped rushing. I stopped proving. I stopped bending myself into the shape of whatever people expected. And somehow, that made me an easy target for women like Marlene. She looked at my independence and saw failure. She looked at my silence and saw weakness. She looked at my empty house and saw warning. But she was wrong. My silence was not weakness. My silence was patience. Marlene lived 4 houses down with her husband Richard and their son Evan, who was 20 and at college most of the year. From the outside, they looked like the kind of family people use as an example when they talk about stability. Their lawn was always trimmed. Their Christmas lights were always perfect. Marlene posted polished family photos online, with captions like times, blessed times, and times grateful times, and times family first. She used words like that a lot. Blessed, grateful, love. But the energy in their house never matched the pictures. Richard was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not thoughtful quiet, more like the quiet of a man who had learned to disappear while still standing in the room. I noticed it because I noticed everything. When Marlene argued, Richard did not answer. He just looked tired. When she laughed too loud at parties, he smiled too late. When she introduced herself as the heart of the home, he stood beside her like a shadow trying not to be seen. I also noticed that she always corrected him in public. Richard can't keep track of anything. Richard would forget his own head if I didn't manage him. Men are simple, really. They need strong women to guide them. People laughed like it was charming. I didn't. I saw the way Richard's jaw tightened every time she humiliated him. I saw the way his eyes flicked to the ground. And I saw the one thing Marlene never noticed because she was too busy performing. Fear. There was fear in that house. Not from him. From her. It started one Tuesday in late October. I was coming home from work when I saw Richard sitting in his truck in my driveway. My first thought was that something was wrong. I walked over, and when he saw me, he nearly jumped. "Claire," he said quickly, wiping his face with his hand. "Sorry. I didn't mean to, I just needed a minute." His eyes were red. That alone made my stomach tighten. "Are you okay?" I asked. He looked at me for a long second, like he wanted to tell me something but couldn't decide whether I was safe. Then he said, "Do you ever feel like your own life is somebody else's joke?" I remember how strange that question felt. I remember the helplessness in his voice. I said, "Sometimes." "Why?" But he only shook his head. "Nothing." Forget I said anything. He drove away before I could say another word. That night, I saw Marlene storming out of her house, her phone pressed hard against her ear. "Where were you?" she shouted, not caring who heard. "Do you know what people will think if you keep disappearing like this? You think I'm going to be embarrassed by you?" Embarrassed by you. I stood by my window and listened. Richard came out behind her, looking like a man carrying a weight nobody else could see. She saw me watching. And then, like she always did, she turned her pain into performance. "Oh, Claire," she called across the yard. "Still home alone? I guess some women just get used to their own company because no one else can tolerate them." Then she smiled. That smile was sharp enough to cut. I smiled back. Not because it was funny. Because I had begun to understand something about Marlene. Women like her do not attack out of confidence. They attack out of panic. A few days later, I noticed Richard leaving the house early in the morning and returning late at night, as if he were trying to avoid every room in his own life. Then one evening, a storm hit. The kind of storm that shakes windows and takes power lines down without warning. The neighborhood went dark. Most people stayed inside, but I had candles and a flashlight ready. I was used to being prepared. My parents had always taught me that. Around 9 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Richard was standing there soaked by rain, holding a small toolbox. "I'm sorry," he said. "My breaker blew and I can't get the garage door to close. I know you're not an electrician, but I remembered you said your brother taught you a little about house repairs. My brother Paul had taught me a lot before he moved away." "Come in," I said. The garage issue took 10 minutes. Richard stood in the kitchen while I used a flashlight and checked the panel outside. He thanked me over and over, but he looked distracted, like he was carrying a sentence in his mouth he couldn't speak. When I came back inside, he was staring at a framed photo on my bookshelf. It was me at 40, smiling at a lake on a trip with friends. "That's you?" he asked. I laughed a little. "Yes, you look different." "Different how?" "Happy." I didn't know what to say to that. He looked embarrassed for even saying it. Then he said something I would not forget. "You know," he murmured almost to himself, "some people only look happy because they know how to hide the damage." I felt a chill run through me. Before I could answer, the front door banged open. Marlene stood there in the rain with an umbrella in one hand and anger in the other. She looked from me to Richard and back again. Then she said, in a voice too sweet to be real, "Well, isn't this nice?" Richard stepped back as if he had been struck. Marlene came in like a queen entering a room she believed belonged to her. "Claire," she said, "I hope my husband hasn't been bothering you." Her eyes were smiling. Her voice was not. "No," I said carefully. "He needed help with the breaker." Marlene turned to Richard. "You couldn't wait one night? You had to come here?" He stared at the floor. "And then? Right there in my kitchen?" She laughed. "It's always so funny to me," she said, "how some women cling to any man who gives them attention, even borrowed attention. I will admit something now. I almost lost my temper. Almost. But then Richard looked up at her, and I saw something in his face that stopped me. Not anger, not love, relief. Like he had been drowning for years and had finally seen the edge of a shore. Marlene did not notice. Or maybe she did and ignored it. She kept going, talking about how single women get strange, and how loneliness can make people imagine things, and how Claire probably thinks every married man in the neighborhood is secretly interested in. Yeah, that last part was meant to shame me, but it landed somewhere else. Because Richard flinched. Just for a second. But I saw it, and I knew then that there was a reason she was afraid whenever he spoke too long, or stayed out too late, or looked too calm. She was not protecting her marriage. She was protecting a lie. The diary came into my life by accident. A week after the storm, Marlene asked me to water her plants while they went out of town for a weekend family emergency. She said it like she expected sympathy. She always did. I should have refused. Instead, I agreed. Not because I cared about her. I cared about what I had seen in Richard's face. I cared about the way fear clung to their house like dust. Their home was beautiful in that staged, suffocating way some homes are beautiful when they belong to someone who wants admiration more than comfort. I watered the plants, checked the mail, and was about to leave when I heard a strange sound from the hallway. A soft hoot, like something had fallen behind a wall. At first, I ignored it. Then I heard it again. I followed the sound to the small study near the back of the house. The room was locked. I stood there for a second listening. Then I noticed something odd. The bookshelf was slightly crooked. I pressed against it, and one section shifted. A hidden compartment. My breath caught in my throat. Inside was a small metal box, old and dented, tucked behind the books like it had been hidden in a hurry. The lock was broken. I opened it. At first, I thought it contained important papers. Instead, it held notebooks, several of them, dark blue covers, worn edges, and one name written inside the first one in careful handwriting. Richard Hale, a diary. My hands started shaking. I knew I should not have read it. I knew that, but I did. And the more I read, the colder my body became. At first, it was normal enough. Thoughts, frustrations, long entries about work, stress, family. But then the tone changed. He wrote about Marlene. Not as a husband would write about a difficult wife. As a prisoner would write about a captor. He wrote that she controlled everything. His money, his phone, his schedule. She tracked his movements, reviewed his calls, read his texts, and had convinced the whole neighborhood that he was disorganized and dependent so nobody would ever believe him if he complained. Then I found the line that made me sit down on the floor. Is greater than, if I tell the truth, she will destroy Evan's life with it. She knows I can't let that happen. I kept reading, and the truth kept opening like a wound. Richard had discovered, years earlier, that Evan was not biologically his. Marlene had been unfaithful very early in their marriage. She had hidden it. She had passed another man's child off as Richard's, and Richard had agreed to stay because he loved the boy and because Marlene threatened to expose private things about him if he ever left. Blackmail. Years of it. The diary was not just sadness. It was evidence. Evidence of emotional abuse, financial control, intimidation, and one secret that could have shattered the family if it ever came out. I sat there in that study, unable to move. All those years, Marlene had mocked me for being single, for being unwanted, for having no one to keep me. While her own marriage had been held together by fear and lies, it made me feel sick. Not because I wanted revenge, because I understood humiliation, and because I knew what it was to have your life judged by people who knew nothing about the pain underneath. For the first time in years, I felt something dangerous rise in me. Not anger exactly, clarity. When Marlene and Richard returned, I put the diary back where I found it. I did not tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted to understand everything first. So I began watching. Quietly. Carefully. I noticed Marlene never let Richard handle family finances alone. I noticed she intercepted his mail. I noticed she corrected him if he spoke to neighbors for too long. I noticed she always said we when she wanted credit and he when she wanted blame. I noticed the tiny way she always made sure people thought she was the stable one and he was the messy one. And then one afternoon, everything shifted again. I was bringing in a package when I heard Marlene and Richard arguing through an open window. Her voice was sharp. His was low. "I'm tired," he said. "Of what?" she snapped. "Of being asked to behave like a husband. I'm tired of pretending." There was a pause. Then Marlene said something in a voice so cold it almost scared me. "You will not ruin this family because you're guilty." My stomach turned. Richard said, "Guilty of what?" "Marlene, loving a child that isn't mine. Loving a life you built on a lie." I froze. That was the first time I heard the truth spoken out loud. Her silence lasted only a second. Then she lashed out with words that made my skin go numb. "If you ever tell anyone, I will make sure Evan never speaks to you again." Richard's voice broke. "He deserves to know who he is. He deserves a stable home," she hissed. "Which is more than you can say." That was when I understood. Marlene was not just hiding an affair. She was using the fear of losing her son to keep Richard trapped. And maybe, just maybe, she was keeping him quiet because if the whole truth came out, people would stop seeing her as the neighborhood queen and start seeing her as what she really was. A woman who had built her entire identity on controlling the story. That night, I did not sleep. I kept thinking about the way she had spent years making fun of me for being alone. How easy it had been for people to accept her version of me. How dangerous it is when one person gets to define another person's worth. I thought about all the times I had stood in my kitchen with my back straight while she mocked me from across the fence. And I realized something important. I had never been her real target. I was just convenient. She needed someone weaker looking than herself to step on so she could feel less afraid of the fractures in her own life. That is what bullies do. They are never as solid as they look. I could have walked away there. I could have told myself the truth was not my problem. And maybe that would have been easier. But then something happened that made the choice impossible. Marlene invited the entire street to a Saturday charity brunch at her house. She loved events like that. She loved performing goodness in front of people. Everyone came. The neighbors, a few church friends, even Evan came home from college for the weekend. He looked tired but polite, the way young men sometimes do when they have spent years learning how to avoid conflict. Marlene was in her element. She wore a pale blue dress, pearls, and a smile that looked like it had been. She made a toast. She talked about family, about grace, about strength. Then she did what she always did. She singled me out. "Claire," she said, holding her glass up slightly, "we're so glad you could come. It must be comforting to be surrounded by families, even if your own life has taken a different path." A few people laughed awkwardly. My face stayed calm. "Marlene ist mir vida." "You know," she continued, "some women are simply not meant to be wives and mothers. And that is fine. There is dignity in accepting what life has given you. The room went quiet. I looked around and saw the same thing I had always seen. People waiting to see whether I would shrink. So I stood up. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just enough for everyone to understand that I was no longer willing to be seated in her story. Actually, I said, my voice steady, I think dignity has less to do with marital status and more to do with honesty. Malene blingde. Richard looked up. Evan frowned. I continued. Still calm, still quiet, but now every word carried. Some people confuse having a family with having the right to humiliate others. And some people spend years calling others broken because they're terrified of what would happen if anyone looked closely at their own house. The silence in that room changed. It stopped being awkward and became dangerous. Marlene's smile stiffened. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked at Richard. He looked back at me, and I saw fear in his eyes, but beneath it something else. Hope. I turned to Marlene and said, "I found your husband's diary." The room went completely still. You could have heard the smallest breath. Marlene's face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal. "That's a lie," she said. "It isn't," I replied. Richard stood up so suddenly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Claire!" he began, but Marlene snapped. "Sit down." Nobody moved. I kept my eyes on her. "In that diary," I said. "He wrote about the control, the threats, the blackmail, and the reason he stayed. He wrote about Evan." Marlene's eyes flashed. "Stop." "He wrote that Evan was not his biological son." A murmur moved through the room like a wave. Evan stared at both of them. Richard closed his eyes. And Marlene, for the first time in all the years I had known her, looked terrified. Not offended, not angry. Terrified. "Don't you dare," she whispered. I did not raise my voice. I already did. What happened next did not feel dramatic in the way people imagine truth feels when it explodes. There was no thunder. No shouting from the crowd. No one fainting. Just a terrible, human silence. Evan looked at Richard, then at Marlene. "Is that true?" he asked. Marlene rushed toward him. "No. No, sweetheart, she is trying to hurt us. She is jealous. She's always been jealous of this family." But her voice was wrong now. Too fast. Too thin. Richard stepped forward, and his hands were trembling. "It's true," he said softly. Marlene turned on him with such rage that even I stepped back. "You traitor." He looked at his son, and his voice broke. "I stayed because I loved you. I stayed because I didn't want to lose you. But I can't keep carrying a lie that big anymore." Evan's face crumpled in a way I will never forget. Not because he was weak, because he was young enough to still believe the adults in his life were supposed to protect him. Then he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "So all these years, I was just a secret?" Marlene tried again to take control. "No, baby. Listen to me. Your father is sick. You're still lying," Richard said. And that one sentence changed everything. Not because it was loud, because it was final. The people at the brunch began to understand that they were not watching a family dispute. They were watching a collapse. Marlene looked at me then, and the hatred in her face was naked now. "You did this," she said. I shook my head once. "No, you did." She started listing insults, throwing words like knives. I was desperate. I was lonely. I was bitter. I was jealous of her marriage. I was angry that no one chose me. And I remember standing there listening to her try to turn my pain into proof of her innocence. That was the moment I stopped feeling sorry for her, because there is something deeply revealing about a person who can only defend themselves by humiliating someone else. I looked at her and said, "You spent years calling me broken. But the truth is, Marlene, I was alone. You were trapped. I was quiet. You were lying. And while you were busy judging my life, your own was falling apart behind a locked door." No one moved. No one interrupted. Even Marlene had nothing left to say for a second. Then Evan walked out. That was the worst part. Not the secret. Not the shouting. Not the crowd. It was the sight of that young man leaving the house with his head down, carrying a family history he had never been allowed to know. Richard followed him, and Marlene, for the first time, was left standing alone in the center of the room she had worked so hard to control. The weeks that followed were ugly. Truth never arrives clean. It comes with paperwork and tears and phone calls and sleepless nights. Richard moved out first. He did not fight for the house. He did not fight for the reputation. He simply started telling the truth where it mattered. About the finances. About the threats. About the way Marlene had isolated him from friends, controlled his money, and used Evan as leverage. Evan asked for a DNA test. He needed certainty. He deserved that much. The result confirmed everything. Marlene's secret finally had a name. And once the truth had a name, it could no longer hide. The neighborhood changed fast. The same people who had laughed when Marlene mocked me suddenly found other places to be. The same women who once smiled while I was humiliated now looked at me with careful eyes and forced kindness. Some apologized, some did not. That is how people are. They are brave after the danger passes. But I did not need apologies. What I needed was peace. And strangely enough, that is what began to grow. Not immediately. Not perfectly. But real peace. Richard came by one afternoon to thank me. He looked different. Lighter but also older. As if truth had taken some years from his face and given him back his spine. I should have left years ago, he said. I was standing on my porch with a cup of tea. You were afraid, I said. He nodded. Yes. And now? He looked toward Marlene's empty house. Now I'm done being afraid of her. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was honest. Evan called me a month later. He asked if we could talk. We met at a small diner on the edge of town. He looked tired. Like someone who had spent too long trying to rebuild reality inside his mind. I need to tell you something, he said. I waited. He swallowed hard. When I was younger, I used to hear her talking about you. My mother? He nodded. She said you were the kind of woman who would end up alone because nobody would ever want a woman with too much pride and not enough softness. I closed my eyes for a moment. He shook his head. I believed her. I think a lot of us believed people like her because she sounded certain. I opened my eyes again. And now? He looked at me with something close to shame. Now I think certainty can be a mask for fear. I smiled a little. Yes, it often is. He asked me if I had been hurt by the things she said over the years. I told him the truth. Of course I was. But hurt does not always mean broken. He sat with that for a while. Then he asked, why didn't you ever fight back sooner? That question mattered. I think a lot of people ask that when they hear a story like this. Why did she wait? Why did she stay quiet? Why did she let it happen? So I told him. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes you wait, because you know the truth is stronger when it arrives at the right time. He looked relieved hearing that, and I realized he had probably spent weeks wondering whether adults ever knew what they were doing. The answer, of course, is that most of us do not. We just do the best we can with the lives we have. As for Marlene, she never became a monster in the town's eyes. People like to soften women like her after the fact. They say she was stressed. They say she was under pressure. They say she made mistakes. And yes, she was human. But she was also cruel. And her cruelty had a pattern. That matters. Because too often people confuse being complicated with being accountable. Marlene lost her image. She lost her control. She lost the version of her life she had spent years polishing for the world. And in the end, that was what hurt her most. Not the truth. Not the betrayal. Not the son she had lied to. The loss of admiration. That was the real love story in her life. She loved being envied. She loved being believed. She loved looking like the woman other women should compare themselves to. But a life built on performance, cannot survive a serious enough light. And when that light hit her house, every crack showed. People ask me now whether I felt victorious when it was all over. The honest answer is yes, but not in the loud way people think. I did not feel victorious because someone else was destroyed. I felt victorious because I stopped letting a liar define me. For years, I let Marlene's words sit in the back of my mind like poison. Broken, unwanted, left behind, too late, too much, not enough. And one by one, I had to take those words apart. Broken? No. Wounded, maybe. Healed, slowly. Unwanted? Wrong. I had been loved badly once, and that taught me to wait for better. Left behind? No. I had stayed where I was long enough to build a life that belonged to me. Too late? No. My life was not late. It was mine. And not enough? That one hurt the most. Because so many women hear it in different forms all their lives. Not pretty enough. Not young enough. Not married enough. Not maternal enough. Not quiet enough. Not bold enough. Not whatever the world decides it wants that day. But I learned something in the middle of that mess. Enough is not something the world gives you. Enough is something you decide. I kept my house. I kept my peace. I kept my name. And slowly, I became the woman I had always been underneath everyone else's opinion. I planted roses in the front yard the following spring. The same roses Marlene had once mocked as sad little single lady flowers. They grew beautifully. My neighbors noticed. Some smiled when they walked by. Some avoided looking at me. That was fine. I did not need their approval anymore. And Marlene? She moved away 6 months later. I heard it from someone else. People said she went to stay with a sister in another state. People said she was starting over. Maybe she was. Maybe starting over is the only honest thing left after a life of lies. I do not wish her misery. I don't. That would mean she still owns a part of me. She does not. What I wish for her is something harder. I wish she one day learns how destructive it is to build your self-worth on someone else's shame. I wish she learns that loneliness is not the same as being alone. And I wish she understands that the people she called broken were often the strongest ones in the room, because broken things can be repaired. Cruelty, if left unchecked, just becomes a habit. And habits are harder to live with than loneliness ever was. So if you are listening to my story, and you have ever been judged for being single, or quiet, or different, or slow to settle, or not fitting the picture somebody else built for you, I want you to remember this. The loudest person in the neighborhood is not always the happiest one. The woman with the perfect smile may be hiding a cracked foundation. The family everyone admires may be surviving on secrets. And the person they call broken may simply be the one who refused to become fake just to be accepted. I was never broken. I was becoming. And the day I found that diary, I did not just uncover Marlene's secret. I uncovered the truth about my own life too. That I was stronger than their gossip. Stronger than their pity. Stronger than the labels they placed on me like they were facts. I was not the woman left behind. I was the woman who stayed long enough to see the truth. And once I saw it, I never looked at my life the same way again. I wish I could say that after that brunch, everything became easy. It did not. Truth has a way of opening doors, but it also lets in a lot of pain before the healing begins. For days after that afternoon, the neighborhood felt different. People stopped laughing on porches. Conversations got quieter when I walked by. Even the air felt heavy, like the street itself knew something had changed. And Marlene disappeared inside her house. At first, she did not come out at all. Her curtains stayed closed. Her car never moved. For someone like her, who lived on being seen, that was almost worse than being shouted at. I kept to my routine. I went to work. I made my coffee in the morning. I watered my roses. I answered only the people who spoke to me with honesty. I had spent too many years reacting to Marlene's poison. I was done giving her that kind of power. But on the third evening after the brunch, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Richard was standing there alone. He looked exhausted, not just tired, emptied out, like someone who had finally stopped running and was now standing still long enough to feel the full weight of everything. He held his hands together in front of him, almost as if he did not know what to do with them. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. I leaned against the door frame and looked at him. For what? For not letting her twist the truth again. I did not answer right away. He swallowed hard and went on. "I've spent years letting her tell me what kind of man I was supposed to be. Weak, forgetful, quiet, easy to manage. She made sure everyone saw me that way because it kept the rest hidden." His voice cracked on the last word. I could see how hard it was for him to say it out loud. Men like Richard are often taught that silence is strength, but silence can also become a cage. I said, "You don't have to explain everything to me." He nodded, but he did not move. Then he looked up and said, "I read the rest of the diary." That made my stomach tighten. "And?" He took a slow breath. "She didn't just lie about Evan's father. She lied about money, too. She had accounts I never knew about. She'd been moving things around for years. Small amounts at first, then bigger ones." I was quiet. He looked ashamed, though none of it was his fault. "She used my name when it helped her," he said, "and she used my silence when it did not." I felt a sharp anger again, but it was cleaner now. Less personal, more focused. He rubbed the back of his neck. "The lawyer says there will be an investigation." I nodded once, then let it happen. He looked at me carefully, like he wanted to ask something else but was afraid of the answer. Finally, he said, "She asked if you planned all of this." I gave a small, tired laugh. "No, I just paid attention." That answer seemed to sit with him, because that was the truth. I had not plotted revenge. I had simply noticed what others had ignored. And sometimes, noticing is enough to change everything. 2 days later, Evan came to my house. He did not knock loudly. He stood there for a moment like he was gathering courage just to be seen. When I opened the door, he looked at me with red eyes and an expression I recognized right away. Not anger, grief. The kind that makes you older in 1 week than you were in the whole year before. "I hope it's okay that I came," he said. "It is." He nodded and glanced down at the porch steps before speaking again. "I've been trying to understand what I'm supposed to feel." I let him speak. "Some things cannot be rushed." "I'm angry at her," he said. "I'm angry at him too, even though he's trying now. I'm angry at everyone who smiled at us for years like we were some perfect family, and I keep thinking, how was any of it real?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, some of it was real. But not all families are built from truth. Sometimes they're built from survival. Sometimes from fear. Sometimes from people refusing to tell the truth because they're scared of what the truth will cost." He nodded slowly. "I keep replaying everything," he said. "The holidays, the birthdays, the photos. I don't know what parts to keep in my head." I stepped aside and let him come in. We sat in my kitchen. The same kitchen where Marlene had once tried to humiliate me in front of the storm. Now it felt like a different place. Safer somehow. Less haunted. Evan looked around, then said quietly, "My mom always made fun of this house." I almost smiled. She made fun of a lot of things. She said your life was too small. I rested my hands on the table. "And what do you think now?" He looked straight at me. "Now I think she was afraid of anything she couldn't control." That was such a simple sentence, but it landed deeply, because that is exactly what she had been. Not strong, not superior, afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of losing admiration. Afraid of being seen without the mask. Afraid of the truth. Evan continued, "I don't want to become like her." That one hurt in a different way. Not because I thought he would, but because I could hear how badly he needed someone to tell him that he would not. So I did. You won't, I said. Because you're asking that question now. People who never question themselves often repeat the harm. People who care enough to ask can choose differently. His shoulders lowered a little. Then he asked, almost in a whisper, "Did you hate us?" I shook my head. No. He looked surprised by that. I pitied the lie, I said. Not the people trapped inside it. That made his eyes fill again. And in that moment, I understood something else. Evan was not just losing a family story. He was losing the version of childhood that told him the adults had everything under control. That kind of loss hurts in a way most people never see. The legal part took longer than anyone wanted. There were meetings, statements, old bank records, attorneys, arguments over property and money, and who knew what, and when. That is what truth looks like when it leaves the house and enters the world. It becomes paper. It becomes evidence. It becomes signatures and dates and questions nobody wants to answer. Marlene fought at first. Of course she did. She denied things. She twisted things. She tried to paint Richard as unstable. She tried to say I had misunderstood the diary, that I had taken private writing out of context, that I was a lonely woman who had invented drama because my own life had too much empty space in it. I almost laughed when I heard that. Even at the end, she still reached for the same insult. Still used my singleness as if it were proof of weakness. But by then, the neighbors had already seen too much. People who once repeated her jokes now looked away when her name came up, not because they were brave, because they were ashamed. And shame is a quieter thing than courage, but sometimes it still moves people in the right direction. The investigator confirmed what Richard had said. There were financial irregularities, hidden accounts, unexplained transfers. Not enough for a headline maybe, but enough to tear open the polished image Marlene had protected for years. And then the final blow came. The diary. Richard turned it over to the lawyer. After that, Marlene could no longer pretend it was some misunderstanding or a private grudge. The pages were her undoing, not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. And honesty is the one thing people like Marlene can never fully defend against. One evening, about a month after everything came out, I saw Marlene outside my gate. For a second, I thought about going back inside, but I did not. I stood where I was. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically, just diminished. Her hair was tied back carelessly. Her face was bare. No perfect lipstick. No polished smile. No performance. She looked at my roses first, then at me. "I wanted to talk," she said. I said nothing. She let out a shaky breath, the kind that comes when someone knows they no longer control the room. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone." I studied her face for a long moment. Even now, even after everything, she was still trying to make it about embarrassment. Not the lies, not the damage, not the son, not the husband, not the years of cruelty. Just the humiliation of being exposed. I said, "You spend years doing the same thing to me." Her mouth tightened. That was different. "How?" She hesitated, and that pause told me everything. People like Marlene always think their cruelty is justified. They call it honesty, concern, wit, standards, truth. Anything except what it really is. I said, "You called me broken because it made you feel less afraid of your own life. But your life was never stronger than mine. It was just louder." That line hit her. I could see it. Because she had no answer. At last, she said very quietly, "I was trying to keep my family together." I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "No, you were trying to keep your image together." Her eyes filled, but I did not know if that was guilt or anger or simply the shock of hearing the truth spoken back to her without fear. She looked down and said, "I never wanted it to get this bad." I believed her, but wanting less damage is not the same as telling the truth. And I told her that. You made your choices one lie at a time, I said. You don't get to be surprised when the lie gets too heavy. She stood there for a second, and I thought maybe she might say something real, something human. But in the end, she only nodded once and walked away. That was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from her. And it was enough. Not because it healed anything between us. It did not. It was enough because I no longer needed her to become decent in order for me to move on. After that, the street changed in a way I never expected. Not overnight. Slowly. One by one, the women who had once smiled through Marlene's comments began talking to me differently. Some apologized in quiet voices. Some admitted they had been afraid of her. Some said they always thought she was harsh but never imagined this. That is the strange thing about neighborhoods. People can live beside cruelty for years and still call it normal until the day it finally falls apart. I forgave some people. Not all of them, but enough. Because holding on to everyone's failure would have kept me tied to the same old pain. And I was done living there. One afternoon, I was trimming the roses when Evan stopped by one last time, before heading back to college. He stood at the gate and looked at me with a kind of sadness that had matured into something stronger. I wanted to say goodbye properly, he said. I walked over to him. Take care of yourself, I told him. He nodded. Then he said, for what it's worth, I don't think you were ever broken. I smiled gently. No, I said. I just took longer to bloom. He looked like that mattered to him. And maybe it did. Maybe we all need someone to remind us that delayed growth is still growth. That silence is not failure. That a life can be quiet and still be full. That being single is not a wound to be explained. Sometimes it is just a season. Sometimes it is a choice. Sometimes it is simply the life that saved you from the wrong one. Now, when I look back, I do not remember Marlene as the woman who destroyed my peace. I remember her as the warning. A warning about what happens when a person builds their whole identity on judgment. A warning about what happens when people let the loudest voice in the room decide who deserves respect. And a warning about the danger of confusing appearance with truth. Because the truth was never that I was broken. The truth was that I had been underestimated. And that is a very different thing. I was underestimated because I was quiet. I was underestimated because I was alone. I was underestimated because I did not fight dirty. But quiet people see a lot. Alone people learn patience. And people who do not fight dirty often know exactly when to strike with the truth. So when I found that diary, I did not just uncover a secret. I uncovered the shape of the whole lie. And once it was exposed, Marlene had no power left over me. None. Today, when people ask about her, I just say, some stories collapse under their own weight. Because they do. And when they do, the people who survive the blame get to breathe again. That is what happened to me. I breathed again. I planted new flowers. I opened my curtains in the morning without dread. I stopped measuring my worth against somebody else's marriage. And little by little, my life became mine again. Not perfect. No dramatic. Just honest. And honesty, after years of being called broken, felt like freedom. The day your bully finally loses power over you is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a completely different one. Because once the noise disappears, you are left alone with yourself. And that can be surprisingly difficult. For years, Marlene had been part of my life whether I wanted her there or not. Every cruel comment, every whispered insult, every fake smile, every moment she made me feel like I was standing outside a world everyone else had been invited into. Then suddenly, she was gone, and the silence she left behind felt strange. Not painful, just unfamiliar. One morning, about 2 months after everything happened, I woke up before sunrise. The neighborhood was still asleep. I made coffee and sat on my front porch wrapped in a blanket. The sky was slowly turning pink. Birds were beginning to wake up. And for the first time in years, nobody was watching me. Nobody was judging me. Nobody was comparing my life to theirs. Nobody was asking why I wasn't married. Nobody was treating me like a cautionary tale. It was just me. And I started crying. Not because I was sad, because I realized how exhausted I had been, how much energy I had spent pretending words didn't hurt, how much effort it took to smile politely when someone reduced your entire existence to your relationship status. People think strength means not feeling pain. They're wrong. Real strength is feeling pain and refusing to let it define you. And I had been doing that for years, without even realizing it. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A woman named Linda knocked on my door. Linda lived 3 streets away. We weren't close. We knew each other the way neighbors know each other. Friendly waves. Brief conversations. Nothing deeper. She stood there looking nervous. "Can we talk?" she asked. I invited her inside. She sat at my kitchen table and stared at her coffee for almost a full minute before speaking. Then she said something that completely surprised me. "I owe you an apology." I stayed quiet. She continued. "There were times when Marlene made comments about you and I laughed. Her eyes filled with tears. I wasn't trying to hurt you, I didn't want her turning on me. I understood immediately. Fear. Fear makes ordinary people do ugly things. Not always because they're cruel. Sometimes because they're cowardly. And cowardice can hurt just as much." Linda wiped her eyes. "I keep thinking about all the times I should have defended you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I could see how much regret she carried. Then I asked her something. "Why are you apologizing now?" She looked surprised. Then she answered honestly, "Because watching everything fall apart made me realize something." "What?" She swallowed. "I wasn't afraid of you. I waited. I was afraid of becoming you." The room went silent. That sentence hit harder than she probably intended, because I suddenly understood something important. Marlene had not just bullied me. She had used me. Used me as an example. Used me as a warning. Used me as a symbol of everything women in our neighborhood were scared of becoming. Single. Independent. Different. Outside the expected path. And people had joined her because they thought staying on her side would protect them. Linda looked ashamed. "I know how terrible that sounds." I nodded. "Because it is terrible." She lowered her eyes. "But it's true." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached across the table and touched her hand. Not because she deserved instant forgiveness, but because honesty deserves acknowledgement, at least sometimes. And for the first time in years, someone was finally being honest. That same month, I started volunteering at the local community center. It wasn't some dramatic, life-changing decision. I simply had extra time, and I wanted to do something useful. The center ran programs for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, abuse, financial hardship, and loss. I thought I would help organize paperwork, maybe answer phones. Instead, I found something unexpected. Stories. So many stories. Stories hidden behind smiles. Stories hidden behind wedding rings. Stories hidden behind family photographs. Stories hidden behind perfect social media posts. One woman had spent 20 years married to a man who controlled every dollar she earned. Another had discovered her husband had a second family. Another had stayed in a relationship because she was terrified of being judged for leaving. Again and again, I heard versions of the same thing. People suffering silently because they were afraid of what others would think. And every time I listened, I thought about Marlene. Not because she was a victim. She wasn't. But because she had spent years selling a fantasy. A fantasy that being married automatically meant being successful. A fantasy that appearances mattered more than reality. A fantasy that had trapped more people than anyone realized. One afternoon, a young woman named Sarah sat across from me. She couldn't have been older than 26. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. My family keeps asking when I'm getting married. I handed her a tissue. She laughed through tears. Every holiday, another tissue. Every birthday, a third tissue. They make me feel like my life hasn't started yet. I listened quietly. Then she asked me a question. Did you ever feel that way? For a second, I almost laughed. If only she knew. I nodded. Yes. What did you do? I thought about it carefully. Then I answered, I stopped asking other people for permission to value my own life. She stared at me, and I could tell those words landed somewhere deep. Because sometimes the thing people need most is not advice. It's permission. Permission to stop apologizing for existing differently. Around that time, something else happened. Something I never expected. I started receiving letters. Not dozens, not hundreds, but enough to surprise me. Some came from women in nearby towns. Some came from people who had heard pieces of the story. Some came from complete strangers. The message was almost always the same. Thank you. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for showing that being single isn't something to be ashamed of. One letter in particular stayed with me. It came from a woman named Beth. She was 62 years old. She had never married, never had children, never fit the image people expected. The letter said, I've spent my entire life being treated like a woman waiting for her real life to begin. I read that sentence 3 times, then a 4th, then a 5th, because it captured something so many people feel but rarely say out loud. The assumption that life only counts if it follows a certain script. Marriage, children, house, grandchildren, the expected milestones. And if your life looks different, people act like you're missing something. But Beth's letter ended with another sentence. A sentence I wrote down and kept. I stopped waiting for my life to begin when I realized it had already been happening the whole time. I still think about that, even now. Winter came, then spring, and little by little, the neighborhood moved on. People always do. Scandals fodder. Gossip finds new targets. Life continues. But not everything returned to normal. Some things changed permanently. Richard moved into a smaller home across town. He and Evan slowly rebuilt their relationship. Not perfectly, but honestly, which is often better. Honesty creates scars. Lies create rot. And scars heal. Rot spreads. Evan eventually found his biological father. That journey wasn't easy. I won't tell all of that story because it belongs to him. But I will say this. Finding the truth hurt. Not finding it would have hurt more. As for Malene, the last time I saw her was almost a year after she moved away. I was visiting a bookstore in another town. She was standing near the entrance. For a second, neither of us spoke. She looked older. Life had finally touched her face. Not cruelly, just honestly, the way reality eventually touches everyone. We stood there looking at each other. 2 women connected by years neither of us could erase. Then she walked toward me. I waited. She stopped a few feet away. And for the first time since I'd known her, there was no performance, no audience, no neighbors, no reputation to protect. Just 2 people. She looked down briefly, then back at me, and quietly said, I was jealous of you. I honestly thought I'd misheard. What? She nodded. I was jealous. I stared at her. For years, I had assumed she hated me. But jealousy? That had never occurred to me. She laughed softly. A sad laugh. You had freedom. I said nothing. You answered, to nobody.